Hey guys, and welcome back. Today we're gonna do Advent of Code 2023 day 9. It's a Saturday. Usually Saturdays are quite hard, especially after the first days. I expected it to be a bit tougher today. It actually wasn't that hard. It just needed to make sure that you understand the problem properly, and then it was actually quite straightforward. So we have an Oasis and Send instability sensor. That sensor gives us some data. So each of these rows represent a different series of data. So we need to go through the input row by row, and then we need to check the difference between each value in the row, calculate the difference, and repeat that until we have a sequence that doesn't change at all, so it only consists of one number. So the first example is just a series of adding 3 to each number, and we reach the end of the sequence after 2 iterations. And once we reach that point, we need to go up again and calculate the next value that should be in there. And if we don't look at the zeros now, they don't matter. The values are built up by adding the left number and the one in between, that is 3. Now for the next part we have 3 plus 3, that leads to 6. Then we have 6 plus 3, and that leads to 9. So we can already see A has to be 3, because before reaching the sequence that only contains 0, you'll always have a sequence that will just contain the same number. That way there won't be any changes between the numbers. And now with the logic we were looking at before, it's 15 plus 3. So B is equal to 18. So today we didn't use a regex, we just split our string by new lines, and then for each new line we split that line by empty spaces and parsed whatever we got there to integers. In Advent of Code I always force unwrap stuff or throw fatal errors just to make sure that if something goes wrong, I'll know immediately. So we just iterate through each of these lines. And then we got the next value for our row. So each row is a number of integers. We will pass that as a parameter to find next value, and a function how to do extrapolation. And then we will just iterate and create those differences until we found a difference that only contains zeros. Run a bit longer. It's always nice to have some progress in there and see that it's actually running, or make sure that you don't run into an infinite loop. And then all we do is we get the difference for each of those values, add them to our array of differences. Once we finished, we will just extrapolate the number we need to and return that number. So calculating the differences, and I just go through each value, calculate the difference between the next value and the current value, make sure that everything's right, and then I return my differences. Now, I used recursion to extrapolate the next values. So instead of a loop, you can always use recursion. I'm not going to explain recursion completely. If you're interested in it, just leave me a comment and I'll do a video about it. So now we start with those values. We're ignoring the zeros because our exit condition in the loop before is if we encounter a sequence that only contains zeros. And because of that, we don't store the sequence that only contains zeros. Since we still have 4 rows, we will start our recursion. Next step will be to call everything with that input. We still have 2 rows, so the next step is calling the function with that input. We still have 2 rows, so in the last part we will call it with only 1 row, and now we will start to bubble up. So we start with our blue function call, then we do the green function call, f in green, then we do the red function call, it's also f, and then we do the yellow function call, f. We return 2, add the last value, which is 6 in that case. So we have 2 plus 6, so that 8. So we have 8 plus 15. Return that to our first function, and now we have 23 plus 45. And that's the 68 we've been looking for. If we don't have any values, I just throw a fatal error. As I said, I want to make sure if something goes wrong, I know quickly. Now, our first base case is if we only have 1 row, that row will be the row where all numbers are the same, and we just return the last number. So in our example, that was the 2 in yellow. And now I start the recursion. We always drop the first row and call our function. So that's the blue, green, red, yellow stuff I just showed you. We will take that value and add the last number of the top row we're currently at. And then we return that value. We first have the yellow 2, then the red 8, and then we finish with our 68. That's all that is to it for part 1. So now instead of extrapolating new values, we want to extend the history. So instead of calculating values on the right side, we now need to calculate those values on the left. So we still have the same rows. It's now taking the first number, subtracting the one at the bottom, and then we get that one. So it's just reversing. This value minus this value returns that value. 0 minus 2 is minus 2. Then we have 3 minus minus 2. That's 5. And then we have 10 minus 5, and that's also 5. So we can use the same logic we already had. The only thing we need to change is how we calculate the values. We have our extrapolate previous value function. We still do it recursively. If we're at the base case, we will still return our last value since they're all the same. We will still drop row by row by row and call it recursively. And now the only difference is we take the first row we currently have, take the first number from it, and then just subtract what we've gotten recursively. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something or at least had some fun, and see you tomorrow.